There we go. Cool. Right, we're rolling. So welcome to episode 4 of Chin Up. I'm James. This is Chris at the top. How you doing,
Is this
buddy?
the fourth one?
It is.
Wow, we've been churning through them, mate.
We have. Smashing it. Yeah, how you been?
Not bad. I'm cold. The heating in my flat's not working. So I've been away for 3 of the last 4 weeks. And it wasn't working when I left the house. I thought it'd sort itself out, but that obviously isn't how heating works. So I've come back and they can't sort it out till Monday. So I'm sitting here wrapped up, blanket on my feet like a little old lady. Just going to try and keep warm over the weekend, mate. How you getting on? How's training been this week?
Yeah, all good, thanks. Tough week this week, knowing that, Christmas acts as a natural deload week.
Mm.
So volume's been quite high this week. Couple more training sessions to do this week. One today, one tomorrow. Rest, deload week next week. So yeah, all been good.
I'm doing Christmas Day with you this year.
I know. Big event.
Bit fun, isn't it?
Yeah. Chris and I are going to be walking around Sainsbury's, arm in arm, pushing our trolley around, getting all the stuff in for Christmas lunch.
All of the carbs in, mate. All of the refeed.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yet to be decided, though, is what we're going to have for dessert. Are you a Christmas pudding man?
I'm in everything, man.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
You and me both. Done.
So yeah, just as much. It's going to be easy to make a list of what we're not going to eat over Christmas.
I think so.
So,
But yeah. So today we are
yeah.
talking about injury. So I feel like in some aspects we're qualified to talk about this because we're made out of chocolate, apparently. But of course, on a serious note, we're actually not really qualified to talk about any of this. So as a disclaimer, we're not injury experts in any way, shape or form, can't treat or offer any specific advice. I think really today is just going to be us talking about our experiences and what we've learned over the years from our own experience, what other people have taught us. I think if anyone does want to read any further on some people who actually are qualified in this sort of thing, definitely recommend Barbell Medicine's resources on pain and injury. They are fantastic. And also a website, I forget the author, but the website's called Pain Science. Very, very interesting.
There's also there's some very good guy called the Prehab guys that I think got a YouTube channel and they've got a Twitter as well. The Prehab guys, really
yes,
good.
Yeah, I think I've seen them on Instagram as well.
Yeah, they're excellent. They've given me a few bits and bobs that have definitely helped over the years. As have you.
Excellent. Glad I could help.
So I mean, I think how long we've been training together? 10 years.
Yeah. On and off for about 10 years, I guess. Various times when you've been kind of living away from Sevenoaks, haven't got to see each other, but whenever we can, we do train together, don't we?
Yeah. I'd say that the one problem we've both had sort of intermittently has been the lower back, and I would say that is a fairly common problem for a lot of people who are lifting. Where did your back problem start, do you think?
Well, interestingly, it started out like it kind of leached off of something completely unrelated. So I actually tore my hamstring sprinting. So I remember really, really cold night at training athletics, really difficult to get warmed up. I was probably about 20 or 21, I believe. And I remember literally, that classic, looks like you've been taken out by a sniper.
Oh yeah, I've had it a couple of times.
Grim. So sprinting, all of a sudden, bang, just goes. Bad bruising. You could literally like put a finger in the hole.
I was going to say, it's like you feel like you've been shot and you actually feel the hole appear in your hamstring, don't you? It's a weird feeling.
It's awful.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's how it all came about initially. So how that relates to my back, I remember being like, well, I can't really sprint. And that was what I was doing at the time, athletics. So I thought, right, back squatting doesn't really use your hamstring. I was an idiot.
Yeah.
And then did some back squats, went down into a fair, like it was a warm-up weight really, went down into the hole, the bottom of a squat, had to really shift my hips, felt like an audible like pop. And then what I believed at the time, something went in my back. And then pretty much from that day on, for the following 6-7 years, had in various severity back pain and issues, ranging all the way from stiffness to nerve pain, like feeling of like fire down my hamstrings into my feet, odd odd stuff. And yeah, how about yourself?
I didn't know that, by the way. I didn't know it was to that extent. I knew you'd had a
Yeah,
few.
it's strange.
Yeah, yeah. My hamstring went a couple of times. I think if you are fast twitch, I know some people that have never had a hamstring go, but I think if you're fast twitch, your hamstrings contract and expand at a rate that some people's don't, and so they are. If you're not, as you say, properly warm, they do just go. Mine went 3 or 4 times, and mate, it was every time. And it's that horrible feeling when it goes. You go, and you know you're going to be out for at least 10 weeks. There's nothing you can do about it. You've just got to rest, be patient, and wait. And yes, it's the worst thing as well. And you see, like I always see it when you see athletes pull up with a hamstring injury, and there's pain on their face, but there's also that despair of like, I've just put all this winter training in. I've got myself to the peak of sharpness. I've probably dieted down for the season, and I'm in peak physical condition. And then ping, my whole season's now over, and I'm not going to be able to do anything until next year. And yes, I always feel for somebody when they get a hamstring. But yeah, mine was. I mean, look, I had 2 hip surgeries when I was a kid. So I had Perthes disease, which is like it's a problem with the femoral head, and they had to kind of turn the head of the femur to fit it better into the joint, the socket, and then they had to put me in like a full body plaster cast, like a think like Scooby Doo villain that's been in a car crash. From my feet to my neck for like 6 months, I didn't move. It's horrendous. And then I was in a wheelchair and in like calipers and crutches and stuff. So I didn't walk for probably a year. Then I had another surgery.
And so, sorry to interrupt. How old were you when you had this done? Sorry.
I was 7 when I first had it. Oh, I had my 7th birthday in plaster. I remember that. So I was 6 and a half, I guess, when I had it done. And then probably didn't walk again until I was probably nearly 8. So it was a long process. They had to reopen up and do another surgery to get rid of all the bolts and stuff that were holding me together. So it was a pretty heavy couple of years. And I don't have a lot of external rotation in my left leg. I have loads in my right and everything's normal. My left it moves backwards and forwards fine, which is why I was able to have a good career as an athlete, but left and right, it doesn't want to play ball. So for me, if I'm kind of conventional squatting, when you get your knees tracking out, it puts a lot of stress on my hip. It just doesn't want to move in the right plane. And obviously I get then a lot of referred lower back pain. My left leg is a little bit shorter than my right, so my hips kind of tilt. Then my upper back compensates by trying to shift the weight over my right foot. So I'm a bit like an S-shaped human, whereas you wouldn't know looking at me necessarily, but when I get fatigued, I get limping, and you can tell people go, "Oh, you're limping, are you okay?" And I don't even realise I'm doing it. It's just my body compensating. And yeah, my lower back as a result, most days it's just a little bit sore, a little bit achy, and I have to just kind of do a little bit of mobility work every day just to make sure that it stays functional. But to be honest, it's been all right. I can deadlift all right, and I can do sort of like hack squatting's fine for me. But there's just certain movements I have to stay away from as a result.
And I mean, as we'll talk about as we go further onto this episode, you over the years you've figured out a way to more or less work around it, haven't you? Like you still have exacerbations of your like symptoms, as it were, but you've worked out what seems to suit your body and perhaps what doesn't. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's a good lesson for anybody really, is that we're all biomechanically, whether you've got a surgically changed mechanical structure like I have, or whether you just have certain biologies that don't lend themselves towards lifting very well. Some people got very long femurs, just joints that are a little bit, everyone's different. You're very well put together for squatting, and your mechanics are great for lifting. I'd say mine probably actually aren't, even if I didn't have the surgery. So it's a case of finding what works for you. And I think, we talked in the first couple of episodes, didn't we, about putting the ego to one side and lifting, making sure you're doing things for you. You don't have to be conventional squatting. You don't have to do any of these things if they really don't suit you, if they're giving you consistent pain or putting you in discomfort. There's so many other things that you can do to get a good workout. So yeah, I found what works for my body for sure.
Yes, that's good. So we'll come back onto that later and in a little bit more detail. But I think first it's probably good to outline injuries probably are inevitable to a degree. I think I should rephrase that. Injuries are probably inevitable to a degree if you are training hard.
Yeah.
I would say. So if we think we can probably define injury as when you apply a load to your body and your ability to recover from or adapting to that load doesn't happen. So you might exceed your ability to recover or adapt. I think that's probably like a fair way of putting it. So if you're training hard, you're constantly pushing, you're trying to progress from week to week, you're trying to overload your body. And at some point you might reach a point where you just can't recover from it. And that's what may cause the injury. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just a case of like, well, if I use a really daft example to illustrate it, one week you can squat 200 kilos. So you say, right, the following week, I'm going to squat 300, and you collapse into a massive heap. That would be like a very like acute, odd way to get injured. But of course, that load has exceeded your ability to actually perform the task. But it's more likely to probably happen accumulatively. So let's say you're a runner and you've got a base mile capacity of like 50 miles per week. And then all of a sudden you decide you're going to up it to 70 the following week or 60 or whatever. You might find that cumulatively that extra 10, 20 miles per week is what is this straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. And that's what causes you to get injured. So it's probably more likely to happen accumulatively rather than something that just bang goes. So if we know that there's that degree of inevitability, it's probably worth for most of us, especially if we train hard, learning about pain, how to deal with injury, so you can still train and maintain your fitness, work around that injury, and do so in the safest way whilst you get towards your goal, whilst your injury heals. And I think, you know, that's a prime example of what we were saying earlier. If you can't do something like a back squat or a deadlift, you find out the best possible alternative for you to do it so that your fitness doesn't actually kind of decay.
Yeah,
I think
100%.
that's a fair way of putting it. So we spoke a little bit about our injuries. What other kind of stuff do you tend to struggle with? So other than squatting, for example, are there any other bits that you'd perhaps like to be able to do, but you can't?
Yeah, I mean, look, as you know, I was a 200 and 400 meter runner for years, and I did a hell of a lot of mileage. And with the mechanical imbalances that I've got, I remember the doctors even saying it. I had 6 monthly checkups from the age of 8 to 15, and obviously as a kid I was really quick, and then I suddenly had like 5 years where I just wasn't really allowed and couldn't do anything. Um, and then I guess I hit puberty, and I was full of fast twitch, so it was suddenly I was really quick again. And I remember my doctor seeing me at 16, going, "Bloody hell, you've really grown." And he said, "My one concern is it's great that you're doing well in this sport." He said, "But I feel with your mechanical imbalances, you might start to have problems in your early 20s, your mid 20s," and that's exactly what did happen. And now I can't run at all. It's not
Mhm.
like I can't run. It's just it's not comfortable for me to run. Listen, we went and did, what did we do, 10K the other day, and it nearly
Yeah,
killed me. Whereas in the old days, that would have been a breeze. So
yeah, would have just been nothing. Your body would have been able to handle it and adapt. And
yeah, exactly. So like my hips, my lower back, my knees didn't feel great. But what I can do is skip, and it burns a similar amount of calories, if not slightly more. Than running. It's static, so you've got a lot more control over the sort of the pattern of movement, especially with running. If you're going uphill, downhill, your gait and your feet, it's if you for me, skipping's great. So that's really what I do. My cardio now, I'll do bike, whether it's a salt bike or watt bike or skipping or whatever, um, and then a bit of boxing, and that's mechanically for me fine. So sometimes I think people feel like they need to run, but actually not everyone's mechanically set up to run again, um, and I don't think it's always a good thing. And so therefore, if there is an alternative, if you start running and you're consistently getting pain every time you run, find something that you can do that burns the calories, works your cardiovascular system, gets you fitter, does all the things you want it to do, but maybe it's a static movement. And skipping can be quite fun because you can do it indoors, you can do it to music, there's variations of what you can do, um, and yeah, it gets you really really fit.
yeah, for sure. And I think going back to what you were saying earlier, yes, I think this is really interesting. So you said when you were speaking to I know this was a long time ago now, mate, you probably don't remember the exact ins and outs, but you were talking to the consultant and they said, oh, I think you might have issues later on.
Mm.
Um, it's interesting because according to the research, and again, this echoes what some of these other guys, like the pain science guys, were talking about, what the barbell medicine guys talk about, is that we have this belief that pain is purely down to like a mechanical damage. So, say for example, you've got back pain, and it's as a result of, I don't know, you did a 1 rep max deadlift in the gym, let's say, and then your back just goes, so to speak. Doesn't get better. So 2 weeks later, you go to get an MRI, and then Bob's your uncle. You have your MRI, and you've got a bulging disc. So you make that connection in your brain that like, oh, right, my disc's bulged as a result of that deadlift. That's probably why my back's hurting, right? Kind of makes like good logical sense. But actually, there's quite patchy evidence as to whether or not you can match the two together. So what we instead know now is that it's not just mechanical causes. That's not to say that it's irrelevant, but it's not just that. It's also psychological and sociological stuff that makes a difference as well. So let's say, for example, this is what made me think of it when you said, so if you had that preconception as a young man from the surgeon and said, you might have problems later on, it enters into your head that that is a possibility and perhaps something to be fearful and wary of, which might lead for you to get your pain symptoms worse later on. So yeah, it's interesting how it's very multifaceted. It's not just down to a case of this is like almost like you're like a car. This is broken. It needs fixing. If it's broken, the machine isn't going to work. There's lots more kind of complicated factors at play. And also, of course, really, really difficult. We all know that sometimes we get those demons, for lack of a better word, those things that are in your head you just can't quite get rid of, some sort of like preconception. And I think experiencing pain is probably no exception.
Yeah,
Quite interesting.
yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, and you know, especially with certain types of pain, back pain can be quite scary. If you get
Yeah, for
a
sure.
if you get
It's so
pain,
debilitating, isn't it? Like,
yeah, and there's certain amount of fear that kind of gets attached to your back pain because you worry that, blimey, I can't walk if my back's bad. Whereas if your elbow hurts or your hand hurts, it's annoying and it might be a bit of a distraction, but it isn't like you don't worry about it as much. You just think, I hope this goes away. Whereas with your back pain, you feel that sharp stabbing and you go, wow, that is quite scary. Um, yeah, no, I think you're right about that, and I guess I know that I've got quite pronounced mechanical imbalances that have been caused by surgery. So I'm able to justify that. When I do get pain, I just think, oh well, it's obviously a byproduct of that. But one thing that, having conversations with you over the years is, if you think that pain's bad, it will be bad. Whereas if you could even gain 10% of the control back by just trying to relax into pain when you do have it, try and move as you can normally. Because the one thing we do is, I think we automatically, when we get pain in our back or hips or wherever it is, we seize up. And then I think that referred pain can cause more sort of mobility issues, because whatever muscle groups are above and below start to tighten as a way of protecting that area, and you're controlling that. Whereas if you just relax and think, right, I just have to move as normal here, yeah, it's still going to be painful because you are in pain by definition, but by trying to just continue as normally as possible, you do give yourself the best chance of at least maintaining some sort of mobility through that period of injury.
yeah, I think so. And I think you, I can't remember what context you used, but I think you used the words maybe fearful or fear.
Yeah,
I think you said like, oh no, sorry, you said back pains can be quite scary. Sorry, I believe.
yeah,
So if you think evolutionary speaking, we were probably designed to avoid fear.
mm,
So I think somehow if you can change the narrative and the relationship you have with pain to not be quite as perhaps scared of it, that can probably help with how you experience it as well. Because
yeah,
you are right, like I remember when like I felt my back go, it was really scary,
yeah,
like really scary. You can't do like anything when your back's really, really hurting you and it spasms, it seizes up, you feel like instantly you're about 60 years older.
mm,
You can't do even the most basic of tasks, putting your shoes on, putting your pants on, whatever it might be. Everything becomes so much more of a challenge. And it's horrible. But again, what we're saying, all this kind of stuff, like try not to be as fearful, try to understand it's not just purely down to mechanical causes. It's still really difficult to rationalize that when you're in the moment, you're in excruciating pain, you can't do what you're used to doing. It's really tough.
yeah. No, it is absolutely. And of course, in terms of training, when you get something like that you feel affects, a lot of your training and a large portion of your body, it's very easy to just go, well, I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
And of course, the knock on of that, mental health wise, can be bad because you're sitting around, you're eating, you're watching TV, you're waiting for an indeterminate period of time. It's not like someone's got a 3 week timer on your back, and then after that, oh, you'll be fine, you'll go back to normal. It just doesn't
Yeah.
work like that. So
No, no,
you
no, of course.
and so
If
people,
only.
yeah, and so people can like injuries have made me fall off the wagon many a time. You know, everything's good. Mate, I pulled a calf muscle. I was in a great block of training about 3 years ago, and I just pulled my calf muscle shadow boxing really badly. It just suddenly went, and I couldn't do anything for about 6 weeks, sort of on my feet. Couldn't even really pedal on a bike, and I just fell off the wagon. I just stopped training. I didn't train my upper body. I just left it, and then I lost a lot of the progress that I'd made. And I think the most important thing, and this is where you've been so helpful to me particularly, is when I've had a particular issue, you've given me a sort of selection or variation of exercise that will mean I can potentially still put a little bit of stress through a body part without the same mechanical stress as going through maybe a problem area, be it a knee or a back or whatever. And it's enabled me to keep pushing through without the pain and without the potential of making an injury worse. So I guess we can talk about some of those specific things a little bit later on. But it's just having those lessons in your head when you do feel an injury come on. Don't let all the doom and gloom just sink in and creep in on you. Think about what can I do to work around this, rather than thinking about what I can't do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's the thing, is it? You need to focus on, right, what can I do versus what you can't. And there will always be something you can do.
Yeah,
Even
100%.
if like worst case scenario is, and of course I do completely understand, again, I've said this before, it's all well and good, not being in the situation that you're in at the moment.
Mm.
But even if you have something where you literally cannot even, for example, step foot in the gym, you could be working on your reading up on your psychology. You could be looking at other skills to try and improve, try and focus and direct your energy into that versus just wallowing in self-pity, worrying about what you can't actually do. But I'll tell you what is interesting. So I've had two major injuries before. So one of them was my back, what we were discussing at first, and the other one was a shoulder dislocation earlier on this year. So just to tell the listeners, so I was incline bench pressing on a bench in a different gym to my own, and it was quite a bit wider than normal. And what happened was, where the bench was so wide, if you can imagine, the back of your arm comes in contact with a wide bench. So in a normal bench, you've got a bit more, it's a bit narrower. So you've got more freedom of motion for your elbows to drop past the midline of your body without coming in contact with the bench. Because this one was wider, the back of my arm was in contact with it. And that, the point of which the bench touched my upper arm became like a fulcrum. The weight of the bar coming down was enough to push the arm bone out of the socket. And I'd had a dislocation. So I was in the middle of this gym,
So
bar
sorry.
pinned, bar pinned to me. I was like, shit, I can't get this bar off me.
Mate, I
So
genuinely didn't. It's the first time I realised it wasn't in your gym, by the way.
yeah, no, it wasn't in my gym at all.
So much sense now.
Yeah, so I was stuck with this bar on me, and it was an early morning session as well, so no one was around. I was like, well, I've got to get this bar off of me. So I rolled it onto my lap. At this time, was kind of a bit taken aback, didn't actually realise I dislocated my shoulder. Stood up with the bar in my hands, instant pain because, of course, my shoulder wasn't even in the socket, trying to hold onto this bar. Had to dump it on the floor, couldn't get the weights off, anything. And at first, a dislocation didn't even come into my head. I just thought, oh, I've torn my pec or something. Anyway, fast forward 4 hours later, when I finally got seen in A&E, dislocation, popped it back in, and then just been recovering ever since. But anyway, point being, with really different experiences this time round with my injury and recovery versus when I had my back injury. So when I had my back injury, I was a lot younger, as I said, 20 or 21, didn't know what I know now. And I allowed myself to fall into the trap of believing that it was all mechanical. So I had MRIs done, and I did have a bulging disc and a slight fracture of one of the vertebrae, which showed up on X-ray. And it really made me feel very, very like fragile. Would worry about what I can and can't do in training. Any flare up, I would be absolutely terrified. And of course, like the symptoms did kind of come and go over the following years with regards to training and stuff like that. It was different amounts that I could and couldn't do. And I believed a lot in getting stuff like massages done. Physios weren't always particularly helpful, and some of the narratives that they led me down would lead me to still believe I was quite fragile. Like lots of telling me what I shouldn't do rather than what I can do, telling me that I shouldn't be back squatting, which might have been true at the time, but because it was what I didn't want to hear, it was really, really difficult pill to swallow. And I just generally had like a pretty negative experience with it all. However, this time round, understood a little bit more about it, and also had a very, very supportive physio. So when I first saw the doctor in A&E, he said, because you're reasonably well muscled, the weight of your arm could pop it out the socket again. So I was thinking, oh, for goodness sake, like I'm literally just going to walk around and my arm's going to pop out the socket. Is it fantastic? But anyway, once I'd then gone to see the physio, she pretty much got me doing some exercises with the arm straight away. Instant confidence boost, felt so much better about it. She was the physio. Shout out to Hannah Perrott, by the way, if she's listening. Probably not. Anyway, so she put me through lots of progressive exercises, week to week, month to month, progressively stronger, better. And you can already tell from how I'm describing it and the language I'm using that it was a much better experience all round compared to what I went through with my back.
Well, also, what I will say is, having trained a bit with you this year, it wasn't that long ago that the dislocation happened, was it?
No, January 30th or 31st.
Yeah, and I mean, you're flying in the gym, so that's got to be a good sign. Given the severity of it. And I remember you calling me a couple of days after it happened, and I was just thinking, blimey, this could really derail a lot of your progress. I know you've had a little bit of issue with some of the squats when you're gripping the bar in terms of the rotation of the joint, but that's
yeah, like mobility wise.
But given that you're 10, 11 months on, you're back benching, your bench is not far off as good as it's ever been. Not far off at all, is it really?
No.
And your squatting and everything's good, and your physique looks great. You're kind of, I don't think you'd even really ever know it had happened, bar a little bit of mobility issues, would you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, some stuff was so when I had the recovery, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbow. So the I don't know if you experienced this. I don't know if it was any different because you were a bit younger. But what was interesting is it made me realise how much of my identity I attach to my ability. So if you're the guy who does loads of squats, well muscled, trains in the gym, and then all of a sudden you have that taken away from you, your sense of self-worth does drop. Like I don't know if you experienced this as well when
Mate,
you perhaps couldn't run or
100%. I went to Loughborough. I mean, I did economics as a degree, but I really went there to run and to compete and to be an athlete. I wasn't thinking about much else. So once I broke my foot midway through my first year, had some surgery to clean out the joint, didn't really work, didn't feel I could put any weight through it properly, and suddenly I realised I was like, I'm not going to be able to run again. This is it now. This is how my body is, and I had to stop. And I was like, what am I actually doing? And then I went to Australia for a year just to get away, just because I didn't really know all my plans of training and competing and everything had just suddenly stopped. And then I realised that I didn't really have any other plans and I sort of needed to. And it's funny because when you're in that mode of training, competing, I talk a lot. One of the key narratives in boxing is that boxers don't have an exit strategy from the sport, and they always get major depression. I think it happens in a lot of sports. When they retire, they don't know what to do. And yeah, they do a little bit of broadcast, but that might be once every 6 weeks. And what are you doing in between then? Is just kind of family life and Monday to Friday normality enough for you? For a lot of people, the answer is no. And that's why it's so crucial to have something else going on in your life other than just training or sport, because we're not going to be able to do this forever. We'll be able to do something forever, but not this. Like, you're not going to be squatting 220 kilos when you're 75. I mean, if you are, then congratulations, but
yeah, why not?
yeah. Yeah, but I'm not going to ever. But it's, yeah, you have to have other things going on. So yeah, a loss of identity, definitely a big thing, and it comes back to what we always talk about with mental health. You have to make sure that this is good, and you have to also be aware of what things can affect this. An injury when you're training maybe takes pressure off other areas of your life, and it acts as a de-stress tool. You have to have other tools in place, whether it's meditation, whether it's reading, whether it's going out seeing your mates, doing something you enjoy. Make sure you have other things in place, because if you do get injured and you can't train, you don't want it to start effing up other areas of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something big time that made me stop and take stock. So once the shoulder was injured, it wasn't even just a case of training I wasn't able to do in the way that I'd like to do it. I couldn't even, because it was my right arm. I could only do stuff with one hand. It was no sniggering at the back, and it was ridiculous. So I couldn't even cook. Couldn't do things like opening my pot of hair gel. I remember that being a frustration. I'd literally have one arm up here trying to unscrew it. It was ridiculous, and it sounds silly, and we can laugh about it now. But at the time, I couldn't even sleep properly. I couldn't even sleep in my bed. I had to sleep on the sofa, sat up, because where your arms in the sling, you don't want to roll. Of course, sorry, you can take your sling off at night, but you don't want to then roll over onto the shoulder in your sleep. So I had to sleep sitting up, and it makes you feel like a bit of a useless sack of shit, because you just can't do anything that you're used to being able to do. You can't do a lot of basic stuff. And it's really tough. So you do have to perhaps have a little think about what your it sounds like we're getting very deep here, but I think it's relevant. You have to work out what your true identity is and what other stuff you've got going for you other than just the gym or whatever else it might be.
Yeah, I feel like there's part of the culture these days where people make connections that are almost not there. So a lot of people will look like, the most followed man on Instagram is Dwayne Johnson, right? And I love The Rock. I've been watching him wrestle since I was a kid. He's one of my favourite people. And I get that being a unit is part of his identity, but it's also part of his genetics. He's built like the 1%. And
yeah, of course,
what a lot of lads do is they see what he's achieved and the money he's got and the films he's in, and they just attribute it solely to his look and his tattoos. And they think, well, if I get big and if I get tattoos, then I too will be Dwayne The Rock Johnson. And it's like, no, Gary from Newcastle, no, you won't, because he's got charisma and drive and a plan and skills and talent and like a wealth of things that make him the 1% that he is, or the less than 1% that he is. And that one part of him, part of his identity, because he's an action movie star.
Yeah, he's on brand in that regard, isn't he?
Yeah, but you by just being in the gym and getting yourself pumped up to this sort of like this level is not going to just give you everything that you want and need. So if that gets taken away from you or it goes, you have to make sure you got other things in place: a life plan, job goals, like family goal, anything you need in your life to be happy. You have to have all those things in place, not just looking good. That's one part of it. It might help you physically, it might help you mentally, but you've got to have so many other things in place. And I think that's what a lot of the younger generation now, who are just in gyms obsessively pumping themselves up, they think that that's going to lead to some sort of happiness and some sort of fulfillment. It isn't, if all the other areas of your life are not where you want them to be. That's the facts.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, wouldn't it, over lockdown, or the various lockdowns we've had, when people haven't been able to access the gyms, whether that's been something that people have experienced. They've had that, because you think for a lot of people, the gym is it's almost like a church, isn't it? It's your community. Yeah. It's where you go to de-stress, like do your exercise. I would imagine a lot of people have found it difficult in that regard. They've had that big part of their life taken away. Oh, what do I do now?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say was we talked about injuries as kind of those like key moments where like almost an accident's happened. Like, you know, mine was a surgery. You've had a couple based on things that have actually happened, kind of severe one moment in time, like a hamstrings popped or a bench injury. But I think sometimes, as you say, that there's like cumulative injuries that can happen over time. And I think it's really important this is one thing I'm just speaking from personal experience now that I know my body well, you have to almost see the warning signs before they happen. Like, prevention's better than cure is an old adage, but it's an adage because it's rooted in truth. If you feel a niggle in some part of your body and you know that previously that niggle was a precursor to you getting injured and being out for 12 weeks, the second you feel that, don't just blindly push through stubbornness and ego. stop what you're doing, because it would be better to cut one session in half than lose potentially 12 weeks of consistency going forwards. And it's one thing I find really frustrating. There's nothing worse than in the middle of a session. What happened 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago? My back went, didn't it? I was doing something completely innocuous. I got this awful back twinge, and I just kind of stopped what I was doing. I moved on to another exercise that was pain free, and then for about a week, I had horrible back pain, but I kept relaxed. I didn't worry too much, and then within 2 weeks, I was back to normal again. Well, had I kept deadlifting, or had I kept whatever I was doing, rowing or whatever, I may have been doing nothing for 8 weeks. And so it's just checking that ego. The moment you get a slight twinge or something that makes you go, not quite sure that felt right, don't just blindly push through, because in the grand scheme of things, as long as you're training consistently, it isn't worth those extra 5 or 6 reps for the sake of 5 or 6 weeks.
No, of course it isn't. And I think that's another good case for being quite mindful of what you've got going on in your life, maybe rating the difficulty of your training sessions or just the individual exercises. So if you're constantly pushing to, say, a 10 RPE, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the RPE scale, rate of perceived exertion, so 10 being 10 out of 10 effort, 1 being lying on the sofa doing nothing. If you're constantly pushing 9 RPE, 10 RPE, and you've also got a stressful period because you're, I don't know, moving house, or you've had some sort of relationship struggle, you're constantly pushing in lots of different areas of life. We go back to what we defined injury as at the start of the podcast, of being loads that you can't recover from, and then something goes. That's much more likely to happen when you've got lots of life stress going on, and as well as constantly pushing yourself in training. So being mindful, being aware of what you've got going on, knowing when to, as you say, Chris, not letting your ego take over, being able to step back a little bit, and that's valuable because it's going to save you progress in the long run.
Yeah, 100%. And, not being afraid to change your plan when you walk into a gym, with me at the moment, I'm working on progressive overload and slightly higher rep ranges. The weight's still good, but I've had a history and a track record of getting injured when I'm working in that sort of 3 to 5 rep range, when the weight is kind of closer to my 1RM, sort of 85 to 90%. Whereas at the moment, probably working more like 65 to 80% of that 1RM for sets of 15, and building a good volume base. And I feel like I'm more comfortable. I don't feel like I'm anywhere near that zone where things are starting to get tough and I'm getting injured. Therefore, if you walk in the gym and you start to warm up and everything feels really good, you feel really strong, take those days when you get them. So that might be a day where I think, actually, I'll do a heavier session today because my body feels good. If I walk in and on the warm up things feel a bit stiff or not quite feeling right, don't be afraid to switch to session B and do slightly higher volume, slightly less weight. Keep your body ticking over, keep moving forwards, but don't just push through. I think stubbornness can sometimes be, especially men. I don't think women have this problem anywhere near as much as men. It's stubbornness can be our worst enemy. You're so goal orientated, you want to hit that mark, but sometimes a back step in the grand scheme of a plan is actually going to help you take 2 steps forward. So, as you say, being mindful, getting in the gym, having your plan, but if you can't execute it, don't just mindlessly try and push through, because the chances of you getting injured are going to increase hugely if you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this echoes what we were saying earlier about the reason why we experience pain is not always just because it's something mechanical, i.e. we're not like a machine. Something doesn't necessarily just go wrong with the mechanism and therefore we experience issues. Our bodies are so complicated. There's psychological issues, there's sociological issues, multitude of different things that can cause these kind of issues. So yeah, it's really, really important. There was one thing I wanted to just go back to because we glossed over it and I think it's quite important. So using myself again as an example. So when I was talking about my shoulder dislocation and having to sleep on the sofa, talking about how there's evidence to show that when you're sleep deprived, your experience of pain is going to be worse as well. So all I just wanted to say was that that's another important aspect to consider, making sure that you're sleeping well, recovering in that department, and your symptoms of pain are probably going to be better. And also, not least, when your sleep is poor, your mood changes. So of course, if you're experiencing low mood, your experience of pain is going to be a lot worse as well, in all likelihood. And it makes for a vicious cycle as well, because, right, you're in a low mood, when you get home from work, because obviously still had to go to work with my arm in a sling, you get home from work, you're knackered because everything takes so much more effort than it normally does. The last thing you actually really want to do is go and do some sort of exercise activity. Your training reduces, so your fitness therefore reduces, and it ends up, you can see where this vicious circle comes in. You can't train, you can't exercise, or at least you've got less inclination to do so. Therefore, your mood decreases even more. And yeah, it sets yourself up for a horrible cycle. So as we were saying earlier, it's important to try and focus on some other stuff as well to increase your sense of self-worth, because you're trying to upskill in another department, for example, or even if it's just, right, if my right arm's buggered and it's in a sling, I'm going to train my left arm. No point in having two atrophying shoulders, biceps, whatever, or you might still be able to train your legs. I think that's really important to remember as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
So I think, any other bits and bobs you want to share about your own experiences? Do you reckon we covered most of our stuff?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of our stuff. Do you know, I just had this thought. I went to a really interesting big data and sport conference about 7, 8 years ago, and I won't mention the football team because it was kind of it was a private conference, but this is one of the biggest football clubs in the world, and their head of sort of S&C, and they had a rehab specialist there, and they kind of using big data on players. It was the first time they started to use it, and they noticed a dramatic dramatic decline in injuries of their players just by using predictive markers for injury. So just doing standardized set of tests with players every single day in training. Might just be hamstring flexibility test. You kind of rating your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, 9 being the point where you can't really stretch it any further. Suddenly, if that angle changes and all of this data is logged by it's whatever percentage they've deemed relevant, they put you straight into a prehab program. Rather than you training that day and training for the next 3 to 4 days, they put you straight into prehab and then assess you after 8 days. You miss the game at the weekend. Mm-hmm. They then assess you midweek the next week, and then if your markers are changed, they then suggest to the management that you play a reduced number of minutes for that following game, and the incidence of injuries were reduced dramatically. And when you looked at the data against some of the other big clubs in the Premier League, they had no such system in place and much higher rates of injury. So again, just sort of reinforcing that. And I mean, okay, it's one case study with one football club, but they're using big data analysis on players, and I think it's quite significant that it backs up that thing of, if you feel like something's tight, you feel like something's not quite right, it's better to back off and maybe do a little bit of mobility work or something than push yourself through a session that day. Because you'll never know whether you would have got injured or not, but the likelihood is you might have saved yourself from strain in a couple of days' time.
Of course, I think people often have a reluctance, don't they, to if they've got a program to follow. Sometimes people have a real reluctance to deviate from that program when it's probably smart to do so. Even if, let's say, for example, I have a squat session and it's 3 sets of 3 back squats at 9 RPE. I know that it's probably, even if I'm not feeling too good, I'll still train, but I might only do 3 sets of 3 at 7 RPE. But that then does not constitute as a completely wasted session.
Ah, not so. Not so.
And I think understanding that, a lot of people have a very binary black and white thinking where they say, right, well, if I can't stick to the plan, what's the point? Whereas I think sometimes it's good to know, of course, if you feel like absolute death and terrible, then of course, maybe it is better to skip the session, but recognize that what you should do on that day probably falls somewhere along some sort of continuum or spectrum, rather than it's not just a case of do the session or don't do the session.
Yeah.
There's probably some sort of sensible middle ground at times as well.
100%. And also when you talked about fatigue as well, about being tired and you being more susceptible to pain, it's also harder to focus when you're tired. I mean, I've been away, did Anthony Joshua fight week last week, went straight up to Manchester, started filming 4 a.m. Monday, filmed straight through to yesterday, and there was a little gym in the hotel we were staying in, but I just didn't have the energy or the focus to train. And the thing is, if you're absolutely exhausted, there's a certain amount of focus that goes into each rep of your squats at the moment, because each one of them is taking a little bit out of you. You've got to be focused. If you feel completely exhausted, fatigued, you've had a bad week, and mentally you're not right, your potentially putting yourself at risk by doing things at that level where everything's so close to the wire that you can't afford for any rep really to be anything less than perfect. And the chances are, if your mind's not right, you're fatigued, one or two of those reps might be less than perfect. And when you've got 200 plus kilos on your back, well, what's going to happen if those reps are less than perfect? So it is worth, as you say, considering your body and mind as one. And if both aren't right, just being not over stubborn and just being happy to readjust your training.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, settle for the next best thing, basically. I think that's a smart way to look at it. So I think now's probably a good time to summarize what we've spoken about, right? So what we're about to talk about now is a direct rip-off from an Instagram post I made a few weeks ago, but it's basically just talking about a good general framework to deal with injuries, come back from them, and hopefully be in the best possible position to move forward. So I think first and foremost, and I must admit, we haven't actually spoken too much about this, which is silly as it's the first point in there, but it's just trying to manage your training load properly. So if you can manage your training load properly, whether that's mileage done per week, whether that's number of sets that you perform per body part, if you manage that and it's part of a proper, well-designed, well-constructed program, your likelihood of getting injured is probably going to decrease. So there's no haphazardly jumping from more to less to more to more to more to much less each week. It actually follows some sort of system and progression. And I think I genuinely think, even I do it, and it's my job to design programs for people, I genuinely think getting a coach is one of the best things you can do in that regard. Or at the very least, if you're not in a financial position to do so, there are countless programs out there that are well designed, that are available off the shelf, so to speak. And if anyone's looking for anything along those lines, make sure to just drop me a message and I'll let them know about it. But I think that's first and foremost the most valuable thing you can do. Nip it in the bud before it happens.
Yeah, of course. And we talked in the previous episodes about the concept of progressive overload, and being consistent with that in different rep ranges, but ultimately I think some people can get ahead of themselves and think, right, I've hit one marker now, I'm going to chuck another 20 kilos on. But when you get to a certain point, the progression doesn't happen in those kind of leaps. It just doesn't. And even if you were able to go from, squatting 60 kilos to squatting 80 kilos, don't allow your body the adjustment period of going in slow increments between 60 and 80, because once you get to 80, your body will be so much better adjusted and prepared, and any potential mechanical stresses that you will have experienced along the way, it will experience them in much smaller increments, that if there is a problem, you're going to know about it with a lot less weight on your back. And so it's just, again, looking at where you want to be, looking at where you are, and instead of seeing it in these sort of three massive leaps, break it right down into smaller, more patient chunks. Your body will be so much more grateful for it in the long run. That's one thing I know we can both attest to over the last 10 years, and I don't think many people would disagree with it. There are so few people in the sort of genetic 0.1% that can take these enormous leaps and go through huge amounts of weight without getting injured. Most of us are built like human beings, and you need to very, very, very steadily and very small increments on the loads that you're lifting in order to progress, and to progress healthily.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, at the risk of going off on a slight tangent, I think it also then encourages people to focus more on the process rather than the outcome as well. So if you do, let's say you do have a goal of deadlifting 200 kilos, and at the moment you can only deadlift 100, it's a bloody long way off. Yeah. So you may as well enjoy the ride and think, right, next week it's 102.5, or I might be. Yeah, of course. Yeah, potentially, right? So yeah, I think for a lot of people, they could do really well to not necessarily forget about the end goal, but put their primary focus on, right, that goal could happen 2 to 5 years down the line. So I should probably focus about what I'm doing next week first, rather than thinking all that kind of distance ahead. Yeah. And I think number two is probably the most important one. I think we have said here about, there might be a pretty big component of your pain, injury, which might not necessarily be mechanical, but nonetheless, there are going to be some times where that is going to be the main cause. There are certain red flags for injury. and therefore you should see a professional if necessary. So that's not to say that every single injury that you have needs urgent medical attention. You don't need to go in A&E just because you've like dropped or like you stubbed your toe in the gym or something like that. But sometimes there will be instances where seeing a medical professional is appropriate. And I think that's worth repeating. But also recognising that sometimes you might get little aches and pains that go away by themselves. And you might not want to go to a physio every time you get a slightly achy shoulder or whatever.
I have dropped just while we're talking about, I dropped a 20-kilo plate on my big toe in Sydney in a gym, and I was wearing sliders, and mate, it was horrendous.
I bet that is rough.
My toe was just like a lump of coal for about 3 weeks. Oh mate, it was awful. But
Could you tell that I was going to say don't get medical attention just because you drop a plate on your toe? And then I
well,
stopped myself and I thought, actually, no, do go to A&E.
Just for the record, do that if you do.
Yeah, please do. Then I think it's also important to be realistic with your expectations as well. So we said right at the start of the podcast, injuries are inevitable to some sort of degree, especially depending on what sort of sport or activity you do. So I know this is quite pertinent at the moment. Rugby's going through a bit of a crisis at the moment with regards to head injury. And due to the nature of that sport, I'm not saying it's obviously right or wrong that someone should definitely experience some sort of horrific long-term head injury, but head injuries are going to be quite likely in rugby in the way that is currently played. So it's understanding what you have a choice whether to engage in a certain activity or not. So therefore you should be weighing up to the risk to reward ratio. And I mean, of course, it's the same for boxing as well, right?
Well, I was talking to, so obviously Hatthor Bjornsson and Eddie Hall are having a boxing match in September. I was talking to the guy that's promoting it this morning, and he just said, I feel, is it the most sensible idea? And I said, look, those are two professional athletes that understand the risk reward. I presume they're getting paid pretty well for it. Therefore, it's the equivalent of gambling a lot of your money. It could pay off. You could lose a fair bit. And if you're willing to take the risk of getting hurt for, how much money is going to hit your account, that's your risk to take as an adult, as someone that makes sensible decisions, and as someone who's an athlete. So with every boxer, they do take the life in their hands every time they step in the ring. The percentage of them that involved in something that's life-changing or fatal is very, very low. It's very tragic when it happens, and when it does happen, it highlights how pertinent the risks are and how present the risks are. But for the vast majority of them, it can change their lives in ways that they just couldn't otherwise. So they take the risk. And like anything, on a smaller scale, whether it's going to the gym, if you're training, you're pushing hard, you are going to be at the risk of being injured. But there are benefits that are too numerous to mention. And therefore, if you deem them to be worth it and beneficial to your life, then take them at your discretion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting as well. We seem to be talking about it a lot. The getting injured in the gym specifically is actually very, very unlikely. Much lower risk of injury compared to, say, playing hockey, football, rugby.
Yeah.
However, I think a lot of people do view it as being quite dangerous in a way, especially with regards to like lower back injuries and stuff like that. Yes, they might be one of the more common injuries that take place in the gym, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it happens to absolutely everyone or it's incredibly likely to happen. Just happens to be that those injuries that do happen quite often are lower back related.
Yeah.
And I think also a lot of people sometimes view it as a negative when we talk about it's your own choice, your own decision. But actually, I think, you know what, it's actually quite empowering. If you can take some degree of control and engage in an activity based on your own choice, I think that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think from my experience, most good things happen when you're slightly outside of your comfort zone. You know yourself when you hit your PBs last week with, what did you have, 210, and you hit an 8 and a 6. Was it?
I wish it was 210 for 5, and then it was 200 for 8 and 6.
8 and then a 6. Yeah, sorry. But ultimately, you had to kind of go through a little bit of grind on those last couple of reps to make that progress and know that you've moved on. And ultimately, anytime you do hit a PB, you're out of your comfort zone. There's a massive sense of satisfaction and achievement by breaking through those little personal barriers and goals.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also your knowledge that you can do that then it probably increases your likelihood of being able to do it again. You know you've got it in you. You know you've got that capability. Build your self-confidence, and I think recovering from an injury is no different to that.
Yeah, and and then it knocks on in other areas of your life, because you kind of think, well, if I take a little risk, things will pay off. Step out of my comfort zone a little bit, try something I haven't before, and you lose the fear of trying something new. I really believe it's a real, like, it's an English culture thing. We're very different to the Australians, the Americans. We're kind of taught almost from like kids to keep in your comfort zone, stay safe, control the virus. It's like you were taught to, almost like trying something and failing is a negative thing. We attach negative connotations to risk and to trying something new. It's very much, get your house, get your mortgage, go to school, get your education, get a steady job. Whereas actually, very rarely did you hear in school, really try and take massive risks, get out of your comfort zone, do this, do that. I sort of wish we had been taught that, because I found that out late. But it's in that comfort zone, in that area, where a lot of the really good stuff can happen in your life. You know yourself, setting up a business and a gym, it's a huge risk, and there's stress attached to it, and there's anxiety and there's uncertainty, but you've planned and you've prepped and you've stepped out of your comfort zone, and now you've got your own fucking gym, and you've got your own clients, and you've got your own business, and it's amazing. You can walk in there and know that as a result of your hard work and planning and your risk taking has paid off. And that's such a good lesson for everybody, and a lot of it that mindset can actually start in a gym. So
yeah, absolutely, of course.
Yeah,
no, very, very, very powerful, even in a way that you perhaps wouldn't necessarily expect.
100%. 100%.
So next one is finding an entry point back into your training. So injuries taking you out of that. How do you determine what your appropriate entry point is? So, for example, for me, when I dislocated my shoulder, my appropriate entry point back in was, well, firstly, off of the recommendation of the physio to do the physio exercises, but it was also to train my left arm and my legs, because of course, right, my right shoulder's dislocated. As I said earlier, that doesn't mean whatsoever that I can't train my left arm or my lower body. And you'd also want to try and work within your reasonable limits of pain as well. So unless you were told otherwise by your medical professional, as should kind of overarch all of the things that we've said here today, pain doesn't always necessarily mean more damage. So throughout your rehab process, of course, your levels of pain are going to undulate somewhat. Some days you're going to feel great, some days not so great. It's all part and parcel of the journey that is recovery, right? So try and perform exercises that don't make the pain worse, and just basically, as we said right at the start, do what you can, focus on that versus what you can't. And that's a good way of approaching it.
Yeah.
And then I think as well, off the back of that, so you're returning back to activity after injury, recognize that pain can be a learned behavior. So you want to try and build your confidence in your ability to do exercise, build your resilience, do different movements, being able to handle any setbacks, because again, this journey is not going to be linear, or very unlikely to be linear. You're not going to literally enter into your rehab process and then be able to just gradually dot your way up. There's probably going to be dips in there, stuff that's going to set you back, but your ability to recover from those setbacks is going to increase your confidence. And I think that's a very important part of coming back from injury. So I think also as well, it's probably a good choice listening to this podcast, because if you are trying to learn about pain, injury, whatever it might be, you're also, you're actually taking the time and making an effort to learn a little bit more about it, so that you can, again, using this word again, you can empower yourself, realize what you're capable of adapting to and overcoming. That's very important. And I think this part is particularly fascinating. So again, on that topic, if you look at athletes who have perhaps had amputations, or were perhaps born to develop in such a way where they might have asymmetry, and you look at these guys, how well they can still perform at such a high level, despite these very obvious changes to how a more able-bodied person would be able to perform. So let's say if you watch at the Paralympics, some of the athletes who run who are above knee amputees, they can run in, compared to a normal person, the most bizarre gait. Nothing about it is linear. their
Right.
hips and legs are rotating around in order to be able to propel themselves forward. Yet they don't then get off the track at the end and they're not taken off in an ambulance or in a wheelchair. They can still thrive, they can perform. And it shows what our bodies are amazing, but what they can actually adapt to, what they can handle, I think is really fascinating. So I think that's very important to remember as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And then finally, what should be your overarching principle with all of this stuff is to just incrementally try and improve things in training slowly over time. So let's say you get back on your training journey after an injury, you're feeling good, you're buzzing to be back in the gym. And I think this happens a lot. And I can hold my hand up and say I've been there as well. Chris, you're probably the same. The first time you go back in, you try and carry on from where you left off before. And it, not necessarily inevitably, but more often than not, you perhaps maybe not end up back at square one, but you do regress somewhat. And I think it's really important to say, look, you know what, I've had X amount of weeks or months or even years off. What is a really sensible way to get started? And I'm not going to let my excitement and joy override that sensible head. So you want to be trying to be mindful of your pain levels. So approaching things slowly, right? If that hurts, I'm going to regress a little bit. I'm not just going to boneheadedly push on, and try and just incrementally improve that over time. And I think if your pain gets a lot worse, you should probably go back to square one and see a professional.
Yeah, agreed, mate. I mean, even in the last, I don't think I've touched a weight probably for 10 days now. Since I last trained, I think I've been away and yeah, haven't touched a weight. And I know that when I do go back, it might be Monday, Tuesday, but I'll
Mm-hmm.
do half what I would have done 2 weeks ago in terms of volume because I know otherwise I'll have horrendous DOMs for 5 days and I won't be able to train again. I'd rather
Yeah.
get two almost half sessions in the next week, be able to recover, not put any mechanical stress on my body, and then after a week of letting myself adapt, start to creep back into it as normal. And that's with 10 days off and no injury. It's just a busy period of life. So it's just like you say, it's checking that ego, not just boneheadedly and stubbornly pushing on all the time because that's where you get injured. And it's not to say always err on the side of caution. If you're having a good day and you fancy a PB and it's there, then take it while it is there. But it's not always going to be there, and you have to remember trying to force it when it isn't is when you can put yourself at risk. And there's nothing more stupid or more pointless when you've got the next 30, 40 years, whatever it is, to train and get yourself in shape. Um, making those kind of short-term decisions, it's hedonistic, and you're only going to do yourself damage in the long run.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Well, mate, I think that's everything. I really enjoyed that. That was good.
Yeah, mate.
An interesting episode.
I'm gonna go and buy a heater now.
Oh, nice. Yeah, get yourself warm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to go through, bud? You reckon that's all?
No, just say Merry Christmas, mate, and
See you on the day.
yeah, we'll do look forward to it. We'll try and get another guest in between Christmas and New Year, shall we?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I think we're gonna try and get a guest on, aren't we, for our next one?
Yeah.
We've got someone in mind who we're trying to get hold of. So if we get that to work, that would be fabulous.
Be pretty
But
cool. Yeah, be pretty cool and pretty relevant to what's happening in between Christmas and New Year as well. All will be revealed if we can get them on, but we won't mention it just in case we don't manage to.
yeah, fingers crossed. Nice one. All right, then, guys. Well, listen. Thanks for listening, everyone. Merry Christmas to you if we don't speak to you before. Sort of what we do. But yeah, have a great one. Stay safe, and we'll speak to you soon.
Cheers, everyone.
Let me hit stop.